Kia ora everyone, welcome back to our next edition of Econ Talks. Gareth, we've seen the latest Reserve Bank announcement recently hitting pause on the official cash rate for the first time in something like 6 or 7 meetings. Now down at 3.25%, quite a lot of room that the Reserve Bank has moved from that sort of high point of 5.5%. But seemingly a bit more caution, unease, uncertainty continuing to hit for the Reserve Bank, which has sort of led to that pause. A little bit shadowed, I guess, by what we've been seeing in the economy up until now. We know that the last time the Reserve Bank met and gave their assessment towards the end of May, they decided to cut at that point, but one member was so uneasy and uncertain about that decision, they actually voted to pause at that point. And a lot of the data we've seen since then, again, sort of fed into this idea that, look, there was just a lot of moving parts and the Reserve Bank probably wanted to wait a bit longer to fully understand everything going on. Yes, there was the tariffs, but there was also the stronger GDP result and similar coming through. Again, a bit more pricing pressure showing through. For the Reserve Bank, what did you make of that statement and what they were saying and what they might be thinking about for the future?
Yeah, you mentioned some of those areas of uncertainty the Reserve Bank has been grappling with. I mean, we know when we look at the inflation numbers and expectations for the second half of this year, that inflation is expected to continue to pick up a bit further from its current rate of 2.5%. One of the areas the bank is looking at there is, okay, all the expectations, all the thinking around that is that it does dissipate out into 2026 and doesn't hang around. But we've been in this position, of course, 4 years ago, 2021. The Reserve Bank was very, very strong at that stage, saying, oh, this pickup in inflation is going to be temporary. And it turned out to be far from that. And they had to, of course, raise interest rates rapidly and probably further than they would have needed to if they had have reacted a little bit further. Now, all the inflation numbers at the moment, when you look at it, what's driving it, it's sort of specific little parts of the CPI and the sort of across the economy in terms of those price pressures, rather than a sense that this is a really broad-based pickup in inflation. But the bank's still looking at that and going, okay, we've only just sort of regained our credibility. We're pushing up towards the top of that 1 to 3% target band for inflation. So let's just hold fire. We'll get some inflation numbers before our next review. And then we'll be able to maybe just assess things a little more fully and whether there's still scope to cut. Alongside that, you mentioned the GDP result as well for the March quarter coming in stronger than the bank had anticipated and at the top end of market expectations. But of course, the data that we've seen since then has been a bit more patchy again, and that reflects, some of the uncertainty coming in from the global economy and the tariffs and potential trade war out there. So Reserve Bank, again, looking at that and going, okay, we know we've cut interest rates a hell of a lot over the last year. We know the effects of that will still take time to come through, but we're just not sure. Have we done enough? Should we wait to see what comes through a bit more before we continue to cut, or should we stimulate a bit further? So they've erred on the side of caution across both of those. The other area of uncertainty, the international stuff that we've touched on, probably not quite as important as it was 6 to 12 weeks ago in previous decisions, although we are moving again through a phase where tariffs are being talked about as that 90-day pause unwinds. But financial markets have been a bit settled there. But the key probably is that for the Reserve Bank, their assessment of the impact of those tariffs for New Zealand from an inflation perspective is settling on it coming through and actually leading to less inflation next year because of softer global economic growth. And one of the things they commented back in May about when they made this choice or made the decision there to cut interest rates was a bit of concern that maybe they were being a little bit sort of dovish on the inflationary impacts of the tariffs. And that may have fed through into that person voting for no change, as you said. So they're waiting to see again how some of that unfolds and whether, they've undercooked the inflation sort of potential out into 2026 because of those international events. So as you say, hell of a lot of moving parts for them to get their head around. I'm not convinced necessarily that by the next review in August, they will have got answers to all of those questions, far from it probably. But at least in August, when they do come to do their next decision in the next meeting, they will have a full forecast run. It will be a monetary policy statement at that time. And so it is a case of, getting near the end of the cutting cycle and going, okay, there's no massive hurry. Let's just take our time and try to get the decision as correct as possible.
Definitely. And I think, for the Reserve Bank, they've also been pretty clear to signal that, look, they're taking a pause at the moment to assess where things stand because of all of those different moving parts. But if the economy continues to evolve broadly as they expect. If you see those inflationary pressures that do dampen back, if you don't see inflation expectations rise significantly, then they still think they've got scope to cut. Back in the May monetary policy statement, when they do have that ability, like you say, to forecast, they'd forecast seeing the official cash rate go down to probably somewhere between 3 and 2.75%. They sort of never give an exact, hey, look, we're going to do this cut at this meeting, but they give you a pretty good idea of where things stand. And so there does seem to be an expectation. In fact, it's our own view at Infometrics that the official cash rate will be cut at least once more at some point the second half of this year, probably August, but we'll wait and see on the data, down to 3%. That's where most forecasters seem to be at the moment. One or two that are then picking further cuts at some point later in the year to 2.75 or 2.5% for the official cash rate. I do think, though, for the Reserve Bank at the moment, they are having to be a bit cautious of where the end is. Market pricing in recent times seems to suggest something like a 60% chance that the official cash rate goes down to 2.75%. But at 60%, again, it's close enough to the, which way do you sort of go? I guess looking at all of the data, Gareth, noting that yes, there might be a short-term pause, but there's a little bit more to go. What does that mean for the economy? Like, is a further cut or two going to do a lot, or realistically, after you've already done quite a lot of the heavy lifting, are we sort of more tinkering at the edges now?
I think it is really about tinkering at the edges. I mean, there are some sort of key areas of the economy where you do expect those interest rates to have an impact. One of those is the housing market, and some people who are arguing for further cuts seem to only be looking at the housing market and going, well, it hasn't come back to life yet. We need to stoke those fires, which I don't think is true, given that housing affordability, rental yields, all that sort of thing, still don't look that great. And I don't think you necessarily want house prices to be taking off again. But of course, there are implications for something like the construction industry if house prices and housing activity does remain reasonably subdued. You're unlikely to see much of a pickup in construction either. But yeah, overall, look, the reality is we've cut interest rates by over 2 percentage points over the last 2 years, and people are still rolling off higher fixed mortgage rates onto lower ones. Yes, that roll off is a bit quicker than it was on the way up because people were fixing shorter. But nevertheless, there is still more of a stimulatory impact to come through in the second half of this year, where I think about 50% of mortgages are due to refix or roll off those previous fixed rates, and even through into the first half of 2026 as well. So, it is probably for me about just a little bit of tinkering at the edges, bearing in mind the Reserve Bank's assessment of a neutral OCR is around about 3%. And if that is their assessment and we're currently at 3.25, well, they would think at least that we're still slightly restricting economic activity and limiting growth. And if the economy is just struggling to really gain momentum, then you can understand the sort of thinking around, well, maybe one or two more cuts just to help cement that recovery going forward.
Definitely, but not at the expense of inflation, right? And that's the difficult balance that I think the Reserve Bank's going to have going forward. We'll continue to assess all of that, the next official cash rate moves, but also what it means in terms of economic activity, the inflation results, and everything else that's going on in one of our future editions of Econ Talks.